Welcome to Dynamics Processors. Well, first off, we need to figure out what they are. So what are Dynamics Processors? Well, in the audio world, Dynamics Processors are most widely used to control the dynamic range of audio signals, and they do this based on an input signal. What does that mean? Well, it means that they automatically control the volume, which is pretty cool. Now, this can be done during a live performance, the recording of live instruments, or during the mixing and mastering stages of audio production. So just about every stage of making a record, concert, things like that, you can use Dynamics Processors, and they probably are being used. Now, you may not have heard them, and if that's the case, then they're probably being applied correctly. So let's look at dynamic range. So before we can jump into Dynamics Processors, we need to understand dynamic range. So what is dynamic range that these Dynamics Processors are controlling? Dynamic range is the difference between the quietest and the loudest parts of an audio signal, all the way from the quietest noise to the loudest peak. Now, this waveform up here is a vocal, and the quiet bits are her breaths, and the loud bits are just, where she reached the top of her vocal performance. So the difference between the breath and her loudest note is the dynamic range of this recording. Again, dynamic range is the difference between the quietest and the loudest parts of an audio signal. So here is that same vocal track, two different versions of it, the actual same recording. The top one is the original, and the bottom one is a compressed version, which has less dynamic range. So you can see out of each one of these phrases, the quiet bits on the pink track are louder than the quiet bits on the orange track, giving the pink track an overall louder volume, but a smaller overall dynamic range. All right, the dynamic range of common sounds. Now, if you are a human, and I hope you are if you're watching this, these are sounds you should be familiar with, or can at least imagine. So the dynamic range of human speech is about 40 decibels. So if I were to meet you on the sidewalk and we were to strike up a conversation, we talked for a little while, and then you said, "Hey, get out of here, you creepy guy." That conversation would be about 40 decibels of dynamic range, from the quietest hello to the loudest shriek of "get away from me." A distorted electric guitar is between 5 and 10 decibels. So when the guitar player dials that in, that's not going to be the loud and the quiet. It's not going to be too much difference between the loud parts and the quiet parts. An orchestra in a concert hall can be as high as 80 decibels from the quietest point to the loudest point. Usually 60 to 80 dB for a concert like that. Now, our ears are really, really sensitive measuring devices, and they can actually hear a dynamic range of about 140 decibels. This is from the quietest quiet that you will ever hear, all the way up to my ears are bleeding because it's really, really, really loud. It's about 140 decibels. In music, there's definitely a difference in dynamic range between the different styles of music. Here are just two examples. The first is a dance pop track, and the dynamic range here is about 15 decibels. So if we look at the quietest section here to the loudest section, that's about 15 dB of volume difference. Likewise, the jazz recording on the bottom here has about 35 decibels of dynamic range. So from the quietest bit here all the way to the loudest bit in the middle, about 35 decibels. So a little over twice the dynamic range between, slam and dance music and, a pretty groovy jazz record. And that brings us into recording music, recording sound, and the dynamic range during recording. Most of us are probably in the right-hand side on this, in the digital recording realm. Now, if you are at home and you plug your microphone into your interface, hit record in Pro Tools or Logic or GarageBand, wherever you're at, you are basically, that's the simplest form of recording that we have. You don't have a whole lot of noise. There is the bad stuff down here at the bottom, so that the very quiet stuff is going to be the operating noise from your interface. Your interface has a preamp built into it, and it has the analog to digital converters, which don't make much noise at all. However, there is a small amount of noise from the microphone, from the electronic components between the microphone and the interface. So that is the noise floor. So all of that electronic noise is the noise floor. We don't want to record in there. We want to record things a little bit louder than that. Otherwise, they'll sound pretty bad. And who out there has, I hope you have, turned things up a little too loud and gotten into the red. That nasty, nasty clipping. In the digital realm, we can record stuff very quiet and stuff pretty loud, and it's very accurate. So if you look to the right-hand side here, you have a very high usable dynamic range. Lots of dynamic range when you plug your microphone into your interface. Now, on the flip side of things, if we go over here to the analog world, let's go back 10 or 15 years. We are recording onto a tape machine. So the tape machine actually has hiss. So there's quite a bit of noise in tape. And we're also let's say we're using some vintage gear. And vintage old gear, preamps, compressors, EQs, all that stuff has a little bit more noise in the actual equipment than nice, new, clean analog gear. So we've got this big noise floor on the bottom here that we don't want to record anything very quiet because it's going to be recorded at the same volume as the noise. And then when we turn it up so we can hear it, we're going to hear the noise. So in the analog world, we need to record stuff fairly loud, but not so loud as it's in the bad distortion. So we use compressors in the analog world while we're recording. So the microphone into the preamp into the compressor to the tape machine, and you get a signal that lives pretty much up here, that never goes down into the nasty stuff. That's pretty cool. But in analog recording, we have a smaller usable dynamic range. So, all right, with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the dynamic processors. There's two families here. Basically, there's compressors, limiters, and expanders, gates. So compressors and limiters live in the same family. Expanders and gates, they live in the same family. Compressors and limiters both reduce the dynamic range of the material. So take that vocal, for example. Think of the quiet breath down here at the bottom, the loud peak at the top. They have a small dynamic range because they've been compressed. Now, if we go over here to the expanders, that quiet breath at the bottom and the loud peak at the top, there's a large dynamic range there because we've run it through an expander, and the expander has taken that quiet breath and turned it down even more because we don't want to hear it. So based on the type of dynamic processor, the process signal will either have more or less dynamic range. And here's just kind of an expanded view of those four dynamics processors. So what I've done is taken an original audio signal and just keep this threshold in mind. Keep that in the back of your head as we go through these other four. So I've got the original audio signal, ran it through a compressor, and here is the compressed audio signal that we got out. So if you look at the threshold, everything above that threshold was turned down, and everything below that threshold remained untouched. So the peaks got quieter. That's from a compressor. Now, the next one here is a limiter. So in the limiter, look at that threshold. Everything just basically got cut off. Well, not so much cut off as stopped. So when peaks tried to go loud, the limiter said, nope, you're getting stopped right here at the threshold. Everything else below it remains untouched. Moving on down to the next family, we've got expanders. So the expander left everything above the threshold, and things below the threshold, it turned them down even more. So the quiet stuff got quieter. And if we move down here to the gate is like an extreme expander. Everything above the threshold stayed the same. Everything below the threshold got turned off. So basically, you are not tall enough to ride this ride. You cannot pass. A gate is very abrupt. So a gate is a very hard expander. So I hope you'll see the correlation here. A limiter is pretty much a very hard compressor, and a gate is a very hard expander. All right, now that we've gone over those basics, the next videos are designed to help you learn all about compressors, limiters, expanders, and gates, and how to use them in your music. So we will start with compressors.